The lights in the old town hall glowed softly as people filled the wooden seats, laughter and chatter filling the air. Everyone came to enjoy the annual charity show, to clap for the young singers and dancers, to have a good night. But among them sat an old man named Henry Dawson, quiet and alone, wearing a brown coat that looked as old as him. His eyes were gentle but tired, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his hat on his knees. When the host read the list of performers, no one noticed Henry's name. Most were excited about the children's choir and the teenage band. No one expected anything from the old man sitting in the back. But when his name was finally called, the host said it with a half smile. And next, we have Mr. Henry Dawson. Some in the audience clapped politely. Others whispered, wondering what an old man could possibly do on stage. Henry stood slowly, his knees stiff, and began to walk toward the stage. His shoes made a soft sound on the wooden floor, and the hall grew a little quiet. The spotlight found him as he reached the piano. His hands shook slightly as he placed them on the edge of the instrument. The piano was large, black, and shiny, a beautiful piece that had been played by many musicians before, but at that moment it seemed to belong only to him. A few people in the audience smiled in amusement. One young boy whispered, "He's too old to play," and his friends laughed. Even the host tried to hide a smirk. Henry didn't look at them. He pulled the bench closer, sat down carefully, and took a deep breath. His fingers hovered above the keys but didn't press them yet. The light above him made the silver in his hair shine, and for a moment he looked like a statue, still fragile, and full of stories no one had heard. He looked at the crowd with eyes that seemed to be searching for something. Then he smiled softly and whispered something no one could hear. The microphone caught only a few words. "This one's for her." Some people leaned forward. Curious, wondering who her was, Henry didn't explain. He just closed his eyes for a moment and let his fingers touch the piano keys. The first sound was soft, like a whisper of wind through old memories. Then came another note, gentle but full of emotion. The room grew quiet, the laughter stopped. The conversations faded away. It was as if the world had paused to listen. The melody he played wasn't a song anyone recognized. It was slow, warm, and full of heartache. The notes rose and fell like a voice crying and then smiling again. People began to look at each other, surprised. The same young boy who laughed earlier now stared at the stage. His mother wiped her eyes without knowing why. The music seemed to touch everyone differently. Reminding some of love, others of loss, Henry's face showed both. His lips moved as if he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. His fingers stopped shaking. They flowed smoothly now, dancing across the piano like they had done this all his life. Each sound he played carried a story. Though no words were spoken, it was not a performance anymore. It was a conversation between his heart and something far away. Maybe a person, maybe a memory. His eyes glistened, but he didn't stop. As the song continued, more people leaned forward. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Some looked at the stage as if seeing a ghost. They realized this wasn't just an old man playing an instrument. It was a man remembering his whole life through music. At the back of the hall, an older woman whispered, "He used to play for someone. Long ago, but she couldn't remember who." The song grew stronger and then softer again. Like waves touching the shore and fading, the light above him flickered slightly. And for a second, Henry's face looked peaceful. When he finally stopped, the last note stayed in the air, hanging like a breath that refused to end. Henry didn't move right away. His fingers rested on the keys. His head bowed slightly. The crowd stayed silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. They were still lost in the feeling that had filled the hall. In that silence, the old man smiled gently. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't hear laughter anymore. He just heard her song, the one he hadn't played for 50 long years. And in that moment, the empty stage wasn't empty anymore. It was alive with love, memory, and the sound of a promise that had never been forgotten. The audience sat frozen in their seats, unsure whether to clap or breathe. The melody still echoed softly through the hall like a ghost refusing to leave. Henry's hands rested gently on the piano keys. His eyes closed as if he could still see her. The woman he had played for half a century ago. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked out into the dim crowd. People waited, expecting him to speak, but he said nothing. Instead, his trembling hand reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed by time, he placed it on the piano gently, flattening the creases. It wasn't sheet music from a store. It was handwritten, In fading blue ink, tiny words filled the paper, and in the corner a name was written, for Clara, 1953. Henry's lips quivered as he looked at it. He whispered, "I never thought I'd play this again." The audience didn't know who Clara was, but they could feel it. The song had been written for her. A few older women in the crowd exchanged looks. Some remembered a young couple who used to walk by the lake every evening long ago. The man had carried a small notebook. The woman always wore a white scarf, but no one could be sure. Time had blurred faces, but not feelings. Henry took another deep breath. His fingers hovered above the keys again. But he didn't start right away. He turned slightly toward the microphone and said softly, "We met when I was 22. She loved the sound of rain, so I wrote her a song that sounded like it." His voice cracked slightly and the audience leaned forward, completely silent. Then he began to play again. The music this time was different, lighter, full of life and laughter. The notes danced up and down, playful, like two people chasing each other through a field. Henry's eyes softened as he played. His back straightened, his hands moved faster, and the tremble disappeared. It was as if his youth had returned for a moment. People began to smile through their tears. They could feel the love inside the music. Every sound carried a memory and a promise made. A dance shared, a kiss stolen under an umbrella. The song wasn't just music anymore. It was a time machine. A young woman in the front row held her hand to her mouth and whispered, "He's playing her life." Beside her, an old man nodded, "No, he's playing their life," as Henry continued. The lights dimmed slightly and the stage seemed to glow around him. The melody slowed, growing softer, almost like a whisper between lovers. And then suddenly there was a pause, a long, aching silence that made the audience hold their breath. He pressed a single low note and tears slipped down his face. The song had changed again, from joy to heartbreak. The room could feel it. Something terrible had happened in that story he was telling. Though no one said a word, the notes grew heavier, slower, as if each one carried weight. The once bright melody now sounded like a goodbye. Henry's face was wet with tears, but he didn't stop. He was back there again, standing in the rain 50 years ago, holding Clara's hand, promising he would never let go. But fate had taken her too soon, leaving him alone with only the melody she loved. In the back of the hall, the janitor, an old friend of Henry's, realized what he was playing. He had heard that song once many years ago. At a train station on a rainy night, Clara had been leaving for the city, and Henry had stood by the piano in the corner, playing as her train pulled away. That was the last time she heard him play. The janitor whispered to himself, "It's her song." Back on stage, Henry's hands moved slower now, his strength fading, but his heart full. Each note seemed to speak directly to someone unseen, as if she was standing beside him again, smiling softly like she used to. The audience could feel that presence too. It was like the air itself had changed. Finally, as the song neared its end, Henry pressed one last trembling note and let his hands rest. The sound lingered, echoing in the corners of the hall. Then silence, complete and deep. For a few seconds no one moved. Then someone clapped. Just one person at first, then another and another, until the whole hall stood, clapping and crying at once. The sound of applause filled the air like thunder, but Henry barely noticed. He looked at the photo still lying on the piano, a young woman with a white scarf and bright eyes. He touched it gently and smiled. "I told you I'd finish it someday," he whispered. As he stood from the bench, a soft wind brushed across the stage, though all the doors were closed. The paper on the piano fluttered, and for a moment, it almost looked like the photograph smiled back. Henry turned and walked slowly off the stage, leaving the photo behind. The crowd kept clapping, their hearts full. None of them would ever forget that night. The night an old man played a song written for love, and for memory that refused to die. The rain began to fall outside the old town hall as people slowly left their seats. Some still wiped their eyes. Others whispered softly about what they had witnessed. The sound of the piano still lived in their ears, as if the music had been carved into their hearts. But Henry Dawson didn't walk home with the rest. Instead, he sat backstage alone, his old hands resting on his knees. The paper with Clara's name was folded neatly again, tucked close to his chest like a heartbeat he refused to lose. A young reporter, barely in her 20s, entered the backstage room hesitantly. Her name was Emily, and she worked for the local newspaper. She had come to take photos of the event. But something about Henry's performance had moved her more than she expected. She approached him quietly and said, "Sir, that song. Who was she?" Henry looked up, surprised anyone cared. His wrinkled face softened.
"Clara Bennett," he said gently. "She was my world."
A long time ago, Emily sat beside him. "Notebook forgotten, you loved her," she said softly. Henry smiled. "I still do." He leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the curtain where the piano waited in the dark. "We met in 1953, he began, his voice trembling at first, but then steady. "I was working at a small cafe on Main Street. They had an old upright piano there. Always out of tune, one afternoon she walked in, wearing a white scarf and humming a song I didn't know. She sat down at a table by the window and the sunlight fell right on her face. She looked like something out of a dream." Emily listened without interrupting, every word painting a picture in her mind. Henry continued, "I started playing. Not for the customers, not for money, but for her. That's how it started. She came back every day, always sitting at the same table. She used to leave me little notes and small napkins with words like, 'Play something happy today,' or 'You missed a note.' But I liked it." His voice cracked with a laugh. "By the 5th week, I had already written her a melody. It was simple, just a few chords, but she called it our song. We'd meet after closing and walk by the river. She'd talk about her dreams, and she wanted to be a painter. I wanted to play for her forever." Emily smiled, but she could sense the heaviness coming. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly. Henry looked down, his eyes glistening under the backstage light. "She got sick," he said. "Back then, medicine wasn't what it is today. One day she stopped coming. I went to her house, and her mother told me she was in the hospital. I played outside her window every night, hoping she could hear me." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "On the 5th night, the nurse came out and told me she had passed away. The last thing she said was, 'Tell Henry to finish the song.'" Emily's eyes filled with tears. She reached for his hand but didn't know what to say. Henry continued, his voice soft. "I never did, I couldn't. Every time I touched the piano, I heard her voice. I put the sheet away and promised I would never play again. 50 years went by, I grew old, the world changed, but the song stayed here," he said, tapping his chest. "Waiting." The sound of rain grew louder outside, echoing against the hall windows. It felt as if even the sky was listening to him. Emily finally asked, "So why now? Why play it tonight?" Henry smiled faintly. "Because last week I found something. A letter." He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but Emily could still read it. It said, "Henry, if you ever play again, promise me you'll smile when you do. Love doesn't end, it just changes its song." Emily wiped her eyes. "She wrote this?" Henry nodded. "Her mother gave it to me after she passed. I never opened it. Not until last week when I felt like time was running short." The old man's eyes softened as he looked at her. "So I came tonight not to show talent, not for applause, but to keep a promise." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the faint drip of rain filled the silence. Then Emily said, "Mr. Dawson, people should know your story." Henry chuckled softly. "Let them remember the song, not me," he said. "The music belongs to her." When Emily left the hall that night, she looked back once. Henry was still sitting beside the piano, head bowed. The photograph of Clara resting beside the keys. The rainlight from the window fell across his face, and for a moment, it almost looked like two shadows sat there, an old man and the woman he'd never stopped loving. Outside, the night was quiet except for the sound of rain, the same sound that had once inspired a song about love, loss, and the kind of promise that even time cannot break. The next morning, the front page of the small-town newspaper carried a simple black and white photo. Henry Dawson sitting at the piano, his eyes closed, his fingers resting gently on the keys. The headline read, "The Old Man Who Played Love Back to Life." People across town who hadn't attended the show began asking who he was. Coffee shop owners kept copies on their counters, school teachers shared it in class, and even the mayor mentioned it during a morning meeting for a few brief hours. Everyone was talking about the man who made the whole town cry with a single song. Henry didn't read the newspaper. He didn't care for attention. He spent the morning sitting by his window, sipping weak tea and staring at the gray sky. The piano sat in the corner of his small apartment, uncovered for the first time in decades. Dust still clung to the edges, but the keys gleamed faintly. As if remembering the night before, he reached out and ran his fingers along them, whispering, "We did it, Clara." A knock came at the door, and when Henry opened it, Emily stood there again, this time holding a small recorder and a notebook. "Mr. Dawson, I hope I'm not bothering you," she said. He smiled faintly. "You're not. Come in." She stepped inside carefully, noticing how tidy everything was: framed photos, an old clock, and one vase of fresh flowers beside a photograph of a woman in a white scarf. Emily sat across from him. "I didn't expect your story to touch so many people," she said. "Everyone's talking about you," Henry chuckled softly. "Funny, isn't it? I spent half my life feeling invisible, and now everyone remembers an old man for playing one song." He turned serious after a moment. "But that's not why I played." "Miss Emily," she nodded. "I know. Then," with hesitation, she said, "I wanted to ask if you'd play again. Maybe at the City Hall concert next week? It's for charity and people want to hear your story." Henry looked toward the piano again, a shadow crossing his face. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "That song was never meant to be performed twice." Emily frowned slightly. "Why not?" He gave a sad smile. "Because I promised Clara that once I finished it, I'd stop." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. "Stop playing?" she asked. He nodded. "Stop everything." She fell silent, unsure what he meant. Later that day, Henry walked to the park alone. The air smelled of rain and earth. Children played near the swings, and an old fountain trickled softly in the background. He sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, the same tree he and Clara had sat under 50 years ago. The bark had grown rough, but it still bore a faint carving. H+C, faded but not forgotten. He ran his hand over it and smiled. "Still here," he whispered. A soft voice came from behind him. "Mr. Dawson?" It was the janitor from the hall, a kind man named Bill, carrying a small brown envelope. "Found this near the piano last night," Bill said. Handing it to him, inside was a piece of folded music paper. The very same sheet Henry had written for Clara decades ago. But there was something new. One last line added in fresh ink. Though Henry hadn't written it, it read, "You finally played it?" "Henry, I heard every note." He stared at it. Heart-pounding, the handwriting looked like hers, delicate, flowing, impossible. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Bill shrugged. "It was sitting right on the piano after everyone left. No one else touched it." Henry sat in silence, feeling his hands tremble. He looked up at the cloudy sky, and for a moment, the sunlight broke through, spilling warmth across the grass. It felt like someone smiling down. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The letter, the music sheet, and the memory of Clara filled his thoughts. He sat at the piano again, touching the keys softly. "Are you really there?" he whispered into the quiet room. A faint breeze moved through the window, and one flower petal from the vase fell gently onto the keys. He smiled. "I'll take that as a yes." He began to play again, not the same song, but something new, slower and more peaceful. It was a farewell song. Though he didn't say it aloud, the notes were tender, like a final conversation between two souls who had waited half a lifetime to speak. Across town, Emily couldn't sleep either. She sat at her desk, writing an article titled "The Song That Time Waited For," when she heard faint music through her window. Carried by the wind, it was distant but clear, the same piano from last night. She looked out and saw a light glowing softly from Henry's apartment. She smiled, whispering, "He's playing again." Inside that small room, Henry's hands slowed, his eyes closed, and his lips curved into the gentlest smile. The song faded softly, one note at a time, until the room fell silent. The next morning, the neighbors found him still sitting at the piano, his head resting peacefully against the keys. The flower that had fallen from the vase now lay across his hands. The newspaper on the table carried his photograph again, this time with a new line written beneath it. He finished her song. The morning sun crept slowly through the blinds of Henry Dawson's small apartment, casting soft golden lines across the room. Everything looked peaceful. The untouched teacup, the folded newspaper, the piano sitting quietly in the corner. Henry still sat there, his hands gently resting on the keys, his face calm and serene. He looked as if he had simply fallen asleep in the middle of a song. The white flower that had dropped onto his fingers the night before now lay perfectly still, as if keeping him company in silence. When the building caretaker knocked that morning, there was no answer. After a few minutes, he entered and froze. He stood quietly for a moment, realizing what had happened. "Goodbye, old man," he whispered softly. He didn't call anyone right away. He just let the moment breathe. The caretaker had heard Henry play that night faintly through the hallway. He had paused by the door, smiling at the sound, never realizing it was the last melody the old pianist would ever play. Within hours, news spread across the small town. The same man who had brought everyone to tears just 2 nights ago was gone. The local radio station mentioned it during the morning broadcast. Henry Dawson, the pianist who captured hearts this week with his song for Clara Bennett, passed away peacefully in his home last night. The announcer's voice cracked slightly near the end. Listeners sat in their kitchens or cars, quiet for a long time after. At the town hall where he had performed, flowers began to appear on the steps. White roses mostly, some tied with old piano key ribbons. A small note was left on the front door. "Thank you for reminding us what love sounds like." Emily was one of the first to arrive at his apartment. Her hands trembled as she placed her notebook down on the table. The old piano caught her eye immediately. On it sat the photograph of Clara, the handwritten song sheet, and the envelope Henry had shown her. She looked at them and whispered, "You kept your promise." Tears blurred her vision as she gently touched the photo frame. The coroner later confirmed that Henry had passed peacefully in his sleep. No signs of struggle, no pain, just a quiet end after playing his final song. Emily stood near the window while others came and went, signing papers and whispering condolences. She noticed something strange. On the sheet of music lying open, there were faint pencil markings, new notes that hadn't been there before. The words above them read, "Together again." She froze, her heart pounding. She knew Henry hadn't written those. His handwriting was heavier, older, but this script looked soft, delicate, almost like Clara's. Emily took a photo of it and pressed the page carefully between her notebook, something inside her whispering that this story wasn't over yet. The following week, the town held a memorial at the same hall where Henry had played. The stage was quiet except for the piano, now decorated with white flowers and lit by a single spotlight. People filled every seat, even those who had never met him. They came because they felt something, not sadness exactly, but warmth, hope. Emily stood at the podium, her voice trembling slightly. "He told me once," she began, "that he didn't play for fame or applause, he played to keep a promise. And when he finished the song, he said he'd stop. I think we all know now what he meant." The crowd listened silently, some holding hands, others nodding softly. After her speech, she placed the photograph of Clara on top of the piano. Beside a small white rose, for a moment no one moved. Then a faint sound came from the piano. Just one soft note, clear and gentle. Everyone froze. The hall was empty, no one near the instrument. Emily felt goosebumps rise on her arms. She looked around, no breeze, no vibration, nothing that could explain it. Yet the sound had been real, pure and perfect. The mayor, standing nearby, whispered, "Did anyone hear that?" And several people nodded silently. Emily smiled through her tears. "He's not gone," she said softly. "He just finished what he came to do." That night, after the memorial, Emily walked home through the quiet streets. She carried the photo she had taken of the final sheet music. When she looked at it again under her lamp, she noticed something she hadn't before. At the bottom of the page, under the new words, "Together again," there was a faint drawing, 2 small figures sitting under an oak tree, one playing piano, the other holding a bouquet of white flowers. She sat back, overwhelmed, whispering to herself, "You really did find each other." Outside, the same soft rain began to fall again, the same kind of rain Clara loved. It tapped gently against the glass as if echoing the rhythm of Henry's final song. Emily closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her in that moment. She understood what Henry had meant when he said love never ends. It doesn't vanish with time or death. It just finds a new way to be heard, somewhere beyond the quiet streets and gray skies. 2 souls sat beneath an endless tree and the music continued, not in a hall or through keys, but in the timeless space between hearts that had never truly let go. Weeks passed since Henry Dawson's final song, yet the memory of that night still lived in every corner of the small town. Cafes played gentle piano melodies in his honor. Children hummed the tune he had written, and the hall where he performed had become a quiet shrine of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes each morning. Someone left a white rose on the piano. Though no one ever saw who it was, some said it was the janitor. Others believed it was a stranger from out of town. But deep down, people whispered a softer story, that it was Clara keeping her promise. Emily found herself drawn to the hall again and again. Sometimes she just sat there after sunset, listening to the silence, hoping to hear the faint echo of his playing. She had written Henry's story for the newspaper, and it spread far beyond their little town. Letters poured in from people all over the country. Widows, soldiers, young lovers, and all saying how his story had reminded them that real love never fades. Some even traveled to visit the piano, leaving small notes with messages like, "I still love her too," or "He waited for her, so will I." But one day, something unexpected happened. The town mayor called Emily to the hall. "You'll want to see this," he said over the phone. When she arrived, the doors were open, and sunlight poured through the windows. The piano gleamed more than usual, but that wasn't what caught her eye. It was the keys. Someone had pressed a few of them, leaving faint marks of dust and fingerprints. The pattern looked deliberate, almost like part of a song. Emily walked closer, her heart pounding. "Who's been in here?" she asked. The janitor shook his head. "No one, miss. I lock up every night. The alarm never goes off." The mayor ran a hand over the piano lid. "This morning when I came in, I heard it. Just one note, soft and clear, then silence." Emily looked at him in disbelief. "The same note from the memorial?" He nodded slowly. "Exactly the same." She placed her hand on the piano, and for a brief second it felt warm. Impossibly warm, as if someone had just been there. She closed her eyes, and in the silence, she could almost hear Henry's voice whispering, "Tell her story now." That evening, she sat by her window staring at the rain, her thoughts spinning. Henry's story had reached thousands, but something told her there was more to tell. She decided to visit the old house where Clara had once lived, a small white cottage on the edge of town, now empty and half forgotten. Ivy covered its walls and dust coated the windows. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the air inside smelled of age and memory. Emily explored slowly, her flashlight cutting through the dimness on the mantelpiece. She found framed photos, a young Clara with her parents, another with Henry at a park bench, both smiling like the world couldn't touch them. In the corner, under a sheet, she saw something that made her breath catch, an easel with a half-finished painting. She pulled the cloth away and gasped. The painting showed a man sitting at a piano, and beside him stood a woman in a white scarf. Her hand was resting on his shoulder, her face glowed with warmth. But what made Emily's heart race was the background. They weren't indoors. They were under an oak tree, the same one from the drawing Henry had left. The same one carved with H+C. Emily's hands shook as she turned the frame around. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "For when the song is finished." She sank to her knees, tears spilling down. It all connected, the letter, the notes, the message on the music sheet. Henry and Clara had both known their love wasn't over. They had been waiting for that final song. Outside, thunder rolled softly, and the rain grew heavier. Emily stood by the window, watching water slide down the glass, and for a brief moment, she saw something impossible. Two figures walking through the rain. Hand in hand, the man carried a coat draped over the woman's shoulders, and as they passed under the streetlight, they both turned, smiling faintly in her direction. Then, just as suddenly, they vanished into the night. The next morning, Emily brought the painting to the town hall. She placed it on the piano beside the white rose and the photograph of Clara. Visitors who came later that day said the hall felt different, warmer, lighter, as if filled with quiet music. Some even swore they heard faint laughter. From that day forward, the piano was never left uncovered again. It stood proudly on the stage, not as an instrument of sorrow, but as a symbol of love that refused to fade. Children grew up hearing the story of Henry and Clara, and every Valentine's Day couples would visit the hall, pressing a single key on the piano for good luck. Emily wrote one last article before leaving town, titled "The Song That Never Ended." She ended it with the words Henry had once said to her, "Love doesn't end, it just changes its song." Years later, visitors would still whisper those same words whenever the piano played softly on its own. One note, gentle and pure, as if Henry and Clara were still there, together, reminding the world that real love never dies. It only finds a new way to be heard. The memorial for Henry Dawson had become more than just a remembrance of a man. It had become a place where the town's heartbeat seemed to slow, where silence spoke louder than words, and where the piano on the stage was more than wood and keys. It was a vessel carrying a love story that had survived 50 years. Emily sat quietly in one of the front rows, notebook in her lap, her hands trembling slightly. She had written about Henry, about Clara, about the song that refused to die, but being here, seeing the hall filled with people whose lives had been touched by his music, she realized words could never capture it fully. Families came in, holding children who had never known Henry but had heard about him in school. Elderly couples held hands and whispered to each other. That was the song I heard 50 years ago. Or he waited and she waited. And now we get to hear it too. The hall smelled faintly of fresh flowers, wax from small candles and old wood polished by generations of footsteps. It was alive with emotion. A soft murmur ran through the crowd as a woman approached the piano carefully. She wore a pale blue coat and carried a small cloth bag. Inside it was a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied carefully with string. Emily watched her curiosity growing. The woman knelt beside the piano, opening the bundle, and carefully placed a folded piece of music sheet on the piano stand. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, unmistakably Clara's. Emily's breath caught as she read it. The notes were new but familiar, an extension of the song Henry had finished all those years ago. Each note carried the same warmth, the same gentle sadness and joy. People in the hall whispered among themselves, some crying softly, others staring at the piano as if it were alive. The woman in blue looked up, her eyes shining, and whispered, "He finished it, and I'm here to finish my part." A hush fell across the hall, heavier than the quiet before any performance. Emily could feel the tension, the anticipation. Every heartbeat seemed to sync with the imagined rhythm of the music. Then slowly the first note rang out. Soft and trembling, the piano played itself. Or at least it seemed so, for no one could see hands pressing the keys. The note carried through the hall like a breeze through autumn leaves. Gentle and alive, one by one, more notes followed, forming the melody Henry had begun, but now enriched, layered, as if two hearts were conversing through music. The audience watched in awe, some holding their chests, others with hands over their mouths for the first time. People could hear Henry and Clara together, their story no longer separated by years or death. It was as if time had bent itself to let them speak. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She realized then why Henry had kept the song all those years, why he hadn't played it for anyone but himself. It wasn't for fame or recognition. It was for this moment, when someone would hear it and feel the love between him and Clara. The piano's notes grew bolder yet tender, filling the corners of the hall with a presence that was almost physical, almost visible. At the back of the hall, the janitor wiped his eyes, muttering softly, "I knew it would happen." They were never apart. Children sat quietly, mesmerized, sensing that they were witnessing something magical. Beyond ordinary life, the air itself seemed charged, humming with the echo of 50 years of longing and devotion. The melody slowed now, like a heartbeat returning to rest after a long run. The last notes lingered in the air, fading gently, and then silence fell, deep and complete. A single white rose on the piano glimmered in the soft light, as if it were keeping the final secret of the song. Emily rose to her feet along with the rest of the hall, but no one clapped. Not yet. Not while the magic of the music still hung in the air. Then a soft murmur of appreciation began, low and hesitant at first, then louder, stronger, until the entire hall erupted in applause. Tears and laughter mingled. Strangers hugged each other. Old friends wept. Everyone had been touched. Not just by a song, but by love itself, enduring, patient, and true. Emily glanced at the piano one last time, imagining Henry and Clara sitting there together, smiling at her, smiling at everyone, smiling at the world they had left a little better than they had found it. The song had ended, but the feeling would remain forever, echoing in hearts, in memories, in the walls of the hall, and in the rain-soaked streets outside, and somewhere beyond the light and shadow. Beyond life and death, two souls finally sat together, listening to their song, whispering to each other hand in hand, as it had always been meant to be. The night fell softly over the town, the streets quiet and glistening from a gentle rain. The memorial at the town hall had ended hours ago, but the piano remained on the stage, bathed in soft golden light. The hall was empty now, yet it seemed alive, as if it remembered every note, every tear, Every whisper from the night of Henry Dawson's final song, Emily lingered in the back. Notebook closed, her heart full. She had stayed behind, drawn to the piano as if it were calling her. She walked slowly up the aisle, each step echoing softly against the wooden floor. The photograph of Clara still rested on the piano, her eyes bright and warm. The folded sheet music that Henry had treasured all those years lay beside it. Emily reached out and touched it gently, her fingers brushing the faded pencil markings. She could almost feel Henry's presence beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers, guiding her through the melody. A soft breeze moved through the open windows, though the doors were closed. The candle flames flickered, and a single white rose, left earlier by an anonymous visitor, trembled slightly on the piano lid. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She whispered, "Is this really happening?" And for a moment the hall answered back in silence. Yet it was not empty. It was full of memory, of love, of the music that had refused to die. Suddenly a note rang out from the piano. Soft and deliberate, she froze, her hand still hovering over the keys. The note was pure, clear, almost trembling. It was the very first note of the song Henry had played decades ago. Emily's eyes widened as another note followed, then another, forming the melody he had written for Clara. Layer by layer the song grew, and though no one was touching the keys, it sounded exactly as it had that night, gentle, tender, full of longing. Emily stepped closer, her fingers brushing lightly against the keys as the invisible hands played. It was as if Henry and Clara were performing together once more, a duet of souls, 50 years apart but now finally reunited. The notes carried through the hall, filling every corner, touching the walls, the ceiling, the empty seats, reaching Emily's heart in ways words could never do. She could see it in her mind's eye. Henry, smiling faintly, his hands steady on the piano. Clara standing beside him, her scarf catching the light, her fingers brushing his shoulder as they played. Neither aged, neither changed. Just two hearts completing the song they had begun all those years ago. The music swelled, gentle and strong at the same time, a miracle born of memory and undying love. A sudden sound of applause echoed softly. Though there was no one in the hall yet, Emily blinked, and the applause seemed to come from the memories themselves, from the people who had felt the music, from the hearts of all who had ever loved. The piano song shifted now, slowing like a heartbeat returning to rest, every note a whisper, a final promise, a farewell yet not a goodbye. Emily knelt beside the piano, placing her hand over the white rose, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She felt as though she had witnessed something sacred, a moment where love and life and memory had all converged. The candle flames reflected in her eyes, and for a brief instant, she could almost see Henry's smile, hear Clara's gentle laugh, and feel the warmth of their hands brushing together as they played. The final note lingered, soft and fading, and then the hall was still. Complete and serene, Emily stood slowly, feeling a quiet reverence in every step. The song had ended, but the story would live forever. In the piano, in the photograph, in the white rose, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by it. As she left the hall and stepped into the rain-soaked street, Emily looked up at the sky, which glowed faintly under the moonlight. She felt a soft presence beside her, warm and comforting, as if Henry and Clara were walking with her, their hands intertwined, whispering softly that their love had never ended, only changed its song. Years later, people would still come to the town hall and leave a white rose on the piano. They would press a key or two and swear they heard a faint melody, the song of two souls who had waited for 50 years to be heard together. Emily, now older, would smile every time she walked past, remembering that night, knowing the truth. Love never dies, it only finds new ways to play, new ways to be remembered, and in the quiet, the piano still plays, forever echoing the love story of Henry Dawson and Clara Bennett, the song that time itself could not silence.